Dr. Anthony Fauci has a new book out diving right back into the pandemic and telling the public exactly what it was like trying to get Donald Trump and his administration to take COVID seriously. In On Call, a doctor's journey in public service, Dr. Fauci describes dozens of worrying interactions, including a 2020 phone call with the former president, where he says Donald Trump tried to urge him to be sunnier about the pandemic, which at that point had killed more than 220,000 Americans. Quote, Tony, I really like you, and you know that, but what the F are you doing? You really need to be positive. Dr. Fauci recounts Donald Trump telling him, quote, you constantly drop bombs on me. Last night on Rachel, Dr. Fauci elaborated.
He wanted it so much to be like the flu, because historically the flu peaks and it goes away in March. April, it's gone, and then you could go on with the election cycle.
It has a season.
So he kept on saying it's going to disappear like magic, and that's when I had to start saying, no, I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen, and I had to do that publicly. And then when that didn't work, he started invoking magical cures like hydroxychloroquine, and then when it became clear that wasn't working, he brought in Scott Atlas, who told him everything he wanted to hear.
Back with us is Jim Messina. Also with us is Dr. Vin Gupta, pulmonologist, global health policy expert, and an MSNBC medical contributor. I think part of, it's interesting to get him on this now, Dr. Gupta, because I think a lot of us have forgotten what it was like during the heady days of the pandemic and what Donald Trump was saying. Bring us back to that moment. I mean, you and I talked almost every day back then. What was it like trying to figure out this novel virus, again, novel because it was brand new, and how the public should react to it?
I mean, Katie, just hearing you talk about it is so evocative of those early days. We were talking about flattening the curve and ventilator supply, things that I think we've lost that memory of. And to your point, I think what really struck me, I think about those moments when you and I talked about bleach, should you or should you not? Hydroxychloroquine, as you mentioned, but something that Dr. Fauci mentioned in that interview with Rachel that struck me was the whole bit about flu. Should you or should you not get the flu vaccine? And that really takes me back to, gosh, where were we as our nation's highest elected official behind the scenes didn't realize that it was important to get the flu shot. And yet he's overseeing all these massive health institutions that's churning out that proactive advice. To me, that really struck me from that interview.
And Dr. Fauci is saying that the priority for Donald Trump was campaigning, was telling people that everything was fine, not telling people how to be safe, not understanding that how to be safe was in conflict with telling everybody that it's all fine.
Well, and to his point, he's found himself with a radiologist, Scott Atlas, who was telling him what he wanted to hear versus what he needed to hear. Yeah. And as he talked about, 1 million lives averted when it came to deaths from the vaccine. We've lost sight of that, especially now as we're thinking about potential future threats like bird flu, where we were once at in 2020.
Yeah, let's talking about future threats like bird flu, and there have been doctors who have said they're worried about it. It's hard to hear that, Jim, especially after all the memories, even the ones that we've forgotten, but the memories that are still left of COVID and how trying that was. How important is it for an administration to be prepared? And do you know anything of how the Biden administration has approached this over the last 4 years?
Yeah, literally it is incredibly important because, as Dr. Gupta was just saying, these things happen in real time, and you need an administration who, first of all, cares about the science, wants to get it right, and second of all, wants to have an honest conversation with the American public and doesn't want to just say it's going to be okay in April. Wants to say, look, these are tough times, we're figuring it out, and I think that's what the Biden administration has done. The problem in this election is people have forgotten some of Trump's behavior. And so moments like this book are really important to remind people how erratic Trump was during those moments.
Yeah, I was reading an article by Brian Stelter in Vanity Fair, just going back to that moment as well. And he writes, remember when Trump predicted COVID would just disappear? Remember when he showed up to the CDC headquarters wearing a campaign hat? Remember when he claimed that Google was building a website to help people find COVID tests and Google didn't know what he was talking about? All of these details that have perhaps been buried or just have been forgotten because 4 years is a long time and people don't want to remember how ugly things were. When you were trying to campaign on an issue of are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, and 4 years ago was the pandemic, Donald Trump's trying to do that. How do you remind people of how bad it was if you are running against somebody who was in charge during that time?
Well, a couple things. One, that's why this debate next week is going to be so important. Part of what Joe Biden has to do in that debate is remind people of the difference between he and Donald Trump, the reason they fired Donald Trump 4 years ago. The second thing is you buy a whole bunch of really expensive TV ads and just put Donald Trump on those TV ads and say, remember all this crazy stuff like bleach, like some of these other things that just made no sense, to start to remind these voters this is not what you want again for another 4 years.
And he kept saying it was just going to go away, or don't test, and you won't have any cases. Poof, everything's fine. Dr. Fauci also talks about, Dr. Gupta, the threats that he faced as a public servant. And he said he was used to hate mail. He had gotten hate mail over his career for various initiatives, for AIDS, for fighting Ebola, racially tinged or homophobic hate mail. But this time he got hate mail directly threatening his life, including what at the time could have been, or he thought in the moments could have been anthrax or ricin, opening up a letter and having white powder fall on him. I mean, you were on our air almost every day during the pandemic. What was your experience as being somebody in the public health sector trying to tell people that they should take this seriously?
Well, you know, Katie, I think it was a microcosm of what he experienced, of course. But to his point, what really resonated was something he mentioned to Rachel about antiretrovirals and that time, what was happening in South Africa, where there was this misinformation being led by the president at the time that antiretrovirals were actually not safe, may propagate the illness, and how they were able to combat that misinformation very effectively because they didn't have the echo chamber of social media and maybe artificial intelligence just augmenting everything. And so we live in a different time where it's much harder to actually combat misinformation.